this question of cluster bombs is a massive point of difference. America says it will supply cluster bombs to Ukraine. Britain has a long-standing opposition to them, which is shared by Rishi Sunak. What do you make of this disagreement? Is Joe Biden right to provide what Ukraine have asked for, or do you understand Britain's position?
I actually think Prime Minister Sunak is handling this situation with a good degree of delicacy. He hasn't, of course, publicly condemned it and in many ways has indicated UK's longstanding position of principle, but has been very firm that he continues to support not only assistance to Ukraine, but what the United States is doing in assisting Ukraine in its fight against Russia. So I do think it's a delicate matter, clearly, but so far it's been handled between London and Washington in a very balanced and good way.
What does it do for the moral case for supporting Ukraine? Because clearly the concern from a British perspective is that cluster bombs are indiscriminate and risk people being caught up in it who are innocent. You know, they're not part of the conflict, if you like. Does this cross a line of, well, trying to help Ukraine win by any means, even if that means essentially playing dirty, lowering yourself to Russia's standards?
Yeah, frankly, I wanted to make that point about Russia's standards. Russia has been using cluster munitions throughout this war of aggression and has been indiscriminately targeting civilians. Just overnight, striking a humanitarian aid center in Zaporizhia and killing 4 people. And so they are doing these kinds of really heinous acts time and time again. So I think we do have to remember this larger context where the fight is against an aggressive Russia. And I think we need to do what we need to do in order to push back and to ensure that the Ukrainian counteroffensive continues to be in the initiative, as President Zelensky said today. And I frankly, I'm not a great lover of cluster munitions myself, but I can definitely see that this is a moment in this war when it's important that the Ukrainian side continue the initiative in their counteroffensive.
Obviously, the big issue at this NATO summit this week, one of them anyway, is the discussion about Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. Rishi Sunak says that Ukraine's rightful place was within the alliance. America taking a slightly less enthusiastic position. Does all of this sort of debate about whether, given that it's not going to happen anytime soon, does all this debate about Ukraine joining NATO end up creating the perception of division amongst Ukraine's allies that Russia could seek to exploit?
I'm smiling because there are always divisions within NATO. And of course, the Russians are always trying to exploit them. That's just the way NATO is and its relationship with Russia is. And that was the same during the Soviet era. The top goal of Soviet propaganda and Soviet diplomacy in Europe was to split the NATO allies from the United States. So this is a situation that the NATO alliance is very accustomed to dealing with. I think they're very savvy about dealing with it. Of course, countries have different points of view and they fight them out around the NATO table. But in the end of the day, I believe that the alliance has never been stronger in terms of its coherence in supporting the Ukrainians in their fight against Russian aggression.
Have you been surprised by the tactics of Vladimir Putin? I mean, your dealings and experience of him before this conflict, we're now well over a year into it. He seems to have made lots of calls which have ended up not panning out the way he hoped. Your experience of him?
Yeah, the first call to invade Ukraine in February of 2022. But it's very interesting to me. We've always said Vladimir Putin is a master tactician. He seemed to be falling off his mastery in the last year and a half because of the disastrous decisions initially to invade Ukraine. But it's interesting to me that just the week after the Wagner Group and Prigozhin were marching on Moscow, Vladimir Putin was meeting with Prigozhin and his military commanders in Moscow. So obviously he's trying to find a way to make it up with those guys and perhaps to try to get them back into the fight in Ukraine. And so it's clear that Putin still has a lot of that tactician's skill under his belt, and we'll see where it leads. But I think the profound strategic mistake he made in the first place was to invade Ukraine, because that's not turning out well for Russia and will not turn out well for Russia.
There's been a lot of focus in the last few weeks on the leadership of NATO, including Ben Wallace, the defense secretary here in the UK, throwing his hat in the ring and then being told to take it out again. Jens Stoltenberg having his term of office extended by another year. It's assumed by many that's to clear the path for Ursula von der Leyen when she's finished as the president of the European Commission. Would you like to see a woman running NATO for the first time, having been a woman who was Deputy Secretary General? Is it time for a woman at the top of NATO?
Absolutely. I believe it's time for a woman to be at the top of NATO. I was the first NATO Deputy Secretary General who happened to be female, so I'd like to see a woman in the top slot. But in the end of the day, I think it has to be absolutely the best candidate. And so it is clear that there were several factors, which include considering who is available at this current time in the merry-go-round of European organization and institution politics, but also who is available among the leaders in the NATO countries. And so I think that it will continue to be a discussion in the coming year. But also, I did want to say that Jens Stoltenberg, from my perspective, has been really an effective leader of NATO. He was my boss while I was there, but he's been very effective during this war, which only broke out in 2022, in driving alliance coherence, which, as I mentioned at the outset, is all important. So I think that it's not a bad decision for him to be still in the position until NATO's 75th anniversary, which will be next year in Washington. It will be celebrated, and then we'll see who steps into those shoes.
What difference would it make having a woman at the top of the NATO military alliance? I mean, bearing in mind that there aren't many women who go around start invading each other's countries and starting wars. Is there something about male leaders that a female leader of NATO could do something about?
Well, I don't know if a female leader could do much about warfare among humankind. We seem to have that as one of our normal characteristics, I'm sorry to say. But there is a ton of literature out there about how women in peace processes, for example, ensure the effectiveness of the peace process at the end, because they have a tendency to bring all stakeholders to the table and to listen to them. And so I do think that a woman at the top of NATO could be very helpful in ensuring that a peace process, should it ensue in Ukraine, could come out well, not only for the countries involved, Ukraine first and foremost, but also for the NATO allies.
And just looking more broadly where we are right now, you know, like you said, NATO marking 75th anniversary next year. The world's a scary place right now, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And it seems scarier by the day.
So what can we do about that? Is it down to organizations like NATO? Is there a risk that actually, in the face of security threats, military threats, climate threats, increasing migration around the globe, that we all sort of pull up the drawbridge and become more nationalistic?
Oh, I hope not. In fact, I was going to speak to the role of the larger institutions around the world. You know, the United Nations, for example, has been instrumental in helping to negotiate this grain deal among the Russians and Ukrainians and the Turks involved as well. Of course, it's at a delicate moment in those negotiations, but the UN has proven its role, to my mind, in this crisis. And furthermore, the European Union has been instrumental in figuring out how, when the time comes, countries in the Union, but also beyond, can help pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine. So I think it's a moment to look at the larger international institutions and the roles they can play, in addition to the importance of the NATO alliance as a defensive alliance.